And hello, everyone. Welcome to the second session of the Climate Finance Academy. This one is going to be on Article 6 and carbon markets, and I'm glad to be with a wonderful team of the Youngo Legacy members that we're very proud to have here. And this session will be moderated by Karishma Ashram, which is our former contact point for the Finance and Markets Working Group. Welcome, Karishma. If you can introduce yourself and we can start the session.
Yes. Hi, everyone, and welcome to the second session of the Climate Finance Academy. As you know, you're the third batch. Number 3 is considered a lucky number, at least in my culture. So we hope that this is going to be super impactful. And then we've also seen that this Climate Finance Academy has grown in numbers, but also in terms of the impact that it is making. And it is becoming more practical and more effective in terms of knowledge transfer. So today we are going to talk about carbon markets and Article 6, but also we have one main beauty of this session today is that half of the speakers are involved and have been involved intensively for Youngo. And you would see on how, being in the youth space can also lead to further engagement in the professional space. So I would invite my colleagues later on, Inji and Bjorn, to share their own experience, how they also channel from the youth space to the professional space, because these are the key aspects that most of us are looking for here. So in your presentations, do keep in mind to keep 1 minute or 30 seconds to share your own experience with Youngo, especially on carbon markets and Article 6, and how, you could link it to the professional space or the industry, basically. So without further ado, I'll start my presentation with voluntary carbon markets. I think, Jen, we would go through the housekeeping rules first. So we would request you to keep your microphones muted and turn on your camera as soon as possible, because we would love to see happy faces and obviously your reactions of receiving those knowledge. And also, it's important to connect, because if I see your name, maybe I would not remember it, but if I see the face with the name, it's easier for me to remember it. And also, if we cross path in the future, it's much easier for interactions, right? So don't feel shy. Do put on your cameras, and if you have any questions, we would welcome it, and you can write it in the chat. And if you like someone's question, put your favorite emojis. Right now I can see a lot of birthday cakes coming down, and a shower of birthday cakes. So let's wish Jen happy birthday, and remember to fill in the attendance form as well. So next slide, I can just jump into the presentation of voluntary carbon market.
Yes.
Please let me know if, yes, I'm sharing. Please let me know if you can see my screen.
Correct.
Correct, okay. So, sorry, I go back. It's bugging a little bit. Okay, so I'm presenting on voluntary carbon markets today, and you have to understand that this is just a snapshot. And if you really want to go into the topic, you would have to deep dive, and you would have more opportunities to basically look into the nitty-gritty of what we are presenting today. Same goes, the presentation that my colleagues would be doing. The topic itself, carbon markets and Article 6, are very technical, but that said, it's not impossible to catch up with whatever we are going to say today. Okay, so let's start with voluntary carbon markets. By a raise of hand, or even by an emoji, let's say, a thumbs up, how many of you have been acquainted or you have come across this term carbon market? You can see Johan has a lot of thumbs up. Carolina, yes. Olive, Matinde. And if in the chat you could tell us how did you come across this term? Were you engaged in it, or you just read it somewhere? What is your interaction for it? Don't be shy. In the indices, so Diana has come across it in the indices. Instruments. Sarah is working on a project that is related to carbon markets. Interesting. So preparing and CDM submissions, negotiations in the master, we saw instrument of carbon markets and also corporate carbon transition plans. Interesting diverse ways that you have come across carbon markets. And I'm sure that even my colleagues would be able to also guide you through in the different aspects that we would be covering today, ranging from projects to integrity issues to also Article 6. You would see how, the carbon market is also related to the climate negotiations as well. So without further ado, I would now move on to a brief introduction to carbon markets, basically. So carbon markets are basically trading systems where we buy and sell carbon credits, and companies or individuals can use those carbon markets to compensate for their greenhouse gas emissions by purchasing those carbon credits from entities. So there are two main types of carbon markets that you might have heard: the compliance carbon markets and the voluntary ones. So how do they differ? You can see here a clear comparison. As I mentioned, this is just a snapshot of, whatever we are covering today. I'm teasing you to go and look further, and these are the main points that you should be looking into when we are talking either on carbon markets or voluntary carbon markets. So one way that you would need to learn more is the compliance versus voluntary carbon markets. As you can see, compliance one is usually known as cap and trade or emission trading system, where it is regulated by governments, and this is based on the organizations. They would have a specific carbon allowance that they would be allowed, and a voluntary carbon market is non-mandatory, so the government does not really come in, and individuals, organizations, and the private sector have the opportunity to purchase and offset their carbon emissions that they can't avoid. We have regulatory bodies that is there in terms of the compliance market, but for the voluntary carbon markets, you would see more of the project developers. We would look into who are the main stakeholders, who are the standard setters, and what happens into this environment of primary stakeholders in the next slide. You can also see how the prices also differ between the voluntary components and voluntary carbon market. And we are also going to look into specific examples or initiatives happening into these. So I would invite you to read further into these differences, and also to understand more about the compliance carbon market, because I'm covering mostly the voluntary carbon market today. So we have two sides of the voluntary carbon market. We have the buy side and the sales side of the market. So just imagine that there is a company, and I'm trying to be as basic as possible. Just imagine that there is a company that wants to compensate their carbon footprint, and they are like the buyers financing the climate actions. They can come from different backgrounds. There is, as you saw, there is no obligations, there is no kind of like regulations so far by governments. So they want to offset their carbon footprint or GHG emissions, and they go and seek those projects that would help them to reduce that. So on the other side, there would be project developers that look into those projects, and they would be looking into, they would be selling those carbon credits. So how are those carbon credits created? There are two major categories. So it could be emission avoidance, where the project helps to prevent or reduce GHG emissions from entering in the atmosphere. For example, it could be an energy efficient project, renewable energy project, avoided deforestation or carbon capture and use any storage. Or it could be a second category where it was an emission removal project, so projects which remove the GHG gases from the atmosphere, for example, reforestation or direct air carbon capture. So these are the two main sales side on the two main projects that you can find that would be used in carbon credit. And then we have a whole set of ecosystem that helps into these transactions to take place. So first, there would be a project identification and planning. So as you can see, these would be either emission reductions, emission avoidance, where the different type of projects could be, as the picture shows, it could be a solar energy or a wind farm being set up that would reduce the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And then the second step would be a project certification, where these projects go through a certification process, but either by the government or independent standards. So government would be in the compliance market, but in the voluntary market, it's by independent standards. And those carbon credits are then issued in voluntary carbon markets. Okay. Thank you. And after those projects reach the compliance, there is a transaction that takes place where the buyer can then claim the tons of carbon emissions reduced or removed, and the credit is retired from the market. So further ado, we would see what you need to learn is the type of voluntary carbon market projects that you would be further looking into, or if you're already familiar to, you would need to look into the maturity level and also the nature of their tech or nature-based solution projects, because this is also an ongoing conversations that is happening in the space, especially with nature financing gaining more prominence. So be mindful that whenever you're working in the space on carbon markets, you would also need a specific overview on how different types of projects are interacting and what does your stakeholders want, be it from the regulators ranging to the private sector, what are their goals in terms of developing those projects. So for you to guide them, it would be necessary that you have a very good overview on the different types of projects that are carried out in this space, and also to know about whether it's sequestration, whether it's avoidance, or it's both. So as you can see, it's clearly within the colors. You would see, for example, reforestation classifies as a sequestration only, but mangrove restoration is sequestration plus avoidance. So gaining these understanding is very important for you, giving you cues on how to understand the projects, how to understand the dynamics between the maturity of the projects as well. When is the projects going to be mature, what is the degree of maturity, and also noting about the nature-based versus tech-related activities, because as I mentioned again, there's a lot of focus on nature-based solutions, a lot of focus on technology and its transformation. So quite important for you to have a look on it. I have added more slides because I know that those slides would be shared with you later on by the Climate Finance Academy. So I have added the narrative on the process and the life cycle of a carbon credit, ranging on how the project design takes place, as you can see, and how does the registration takes place, about the standard status, Verra gold standard, and the MRV process, the issuance, where does it happen, and the retirement. So these are the key aspects, the 6 key aspects that you need to read further when you are also deep diving into voluntary carbon markets. So I would encourage you to do further reading on these, look for resources that will explain to you on these life cycle process. And this is also important because here, if you are interacting with standard setters, verifiers, it's important to know about their own aspects and where do they come in. We have 4 main verifiers, as you can read, and all of them have specific focus, be it, in terms of geography. As you can read, some of them are globally dominant, some of them are mostly in US, or they are doing pilot project in Mexico, or gold standard is mostly from EU. And the sectoral scope is also very important because when you're advising, let's say, a client, or be it the private sector or project developer, it's also key for you to know where those standard setters fall in and what would be most relevant for you to advise on. So please do go through these verifiers profile, look into the reports that they are publishing, join their webinars if possible, because I know that they keep updating on their verifying status and reporting systems. So do join these discussions with them if you have an increasing interest in carbon markets. It's very technical once again. What we are giving you is a snapshot for you to deep dive into it. And this is like the market map of how the new voluntary carbon market is evolving. So you can see that who are the big corporates buying, the NGOs or international institutes that are involved into advocacy, engagement in carbon markets, but you also see what are the marketplaces, API providers, where does the carbon market sit in, what are the type of exchanges, where can you go and sell or buy those voluntary carbon credits, who are the brokers. So here you can have an overview on where are the big players, and also if you want to have a career or you want to know advice, like I said, a client, you would know on the different ecosystem that is out there. So here, if you read them, once we have the carbon credit, it has to be sold. So you can see the brokers, exchanges, traders, direct sales, how does it happen? And sometimes we are also talking now more about the interaction of blockchain and carbon credits. So you can also see meta registries, API providers, and then also standards and registries. Where do they come from? So a lot of momentum and initiatives ongoing in this area, which we invite you to look into depending on your personal interest. So for example, if you want to look on the a standard setting side of carbon markets, then you probably would have to look into governance and accreditation, standard and registries. If you're more interested into project development, then maybe you would need to look into these specific methodologies that are developed for each type of projects, what is happening over there. And also, if you want to look into the financing aspect of those projects, then financing and advisory, this is where you could lend, like Carbon Trust, Carbon Trust, Offshore, IDB, MDBs, multilateral development banks doing those initiatives. So a lot to say. We are very passionate. We are a team of members very passionate today to talk to you about carbon markets, especially coming from different backgrounds. And this is where I'm going to end my intervention, probably thinking that I'm still within time, that you should look into those different initiatives that are coming up. They're already ongoing because voluntary carbon market started without any rules, right? And then there are several ambiguities or gray area that started popping up. For example, greenwashing concerns, or even what companies are doing beyond carbon neutrality, or the legal aspect of carbon markets. So this is why two key initiatives came into place: the voluntary carbon markets integrity initiative called the VCMI. Here you would read about how they put into place the code of practice. They are advising on how best to ensure integrity into carbon markets. And then there is another one called the Integrity Council for Voluntary Carbon Markets. But both of them should work in parallel or hand in hand, so that they can ensure integrity in terms of the carbon credit, so that it does not go totally 100% unregulated, but there's also some kind of guidance on how best practices to avoid greenwashing, legal complexity, and the concerns related to carbon markets. So voluntary carbon markets is very dynamic, very, very dynamic, evolving at a fast pace, as you can see, and also evolving at a pace with in relation to other narratives, other trends ongoing in climate finance space in general. So if you want, this is just a teaser. You can look into these different aspects. The slides will be shared with you. And we are more than happy to hear from you during the Q&As. If you have questions, drop it in the chat. And yeah, that's it from me. And hopefully I was within time. Thank you. Yes,
Thank you so much, Karishma.
Yes, I will stop sharing my screen and pass on the baton to my colleague Bjorn, joining us from Singapore. So Bjorn is also part of Youngo, and still part of Youngo. We've known each other when we started, just like you, to be honest, trying to follow the carbon markets and in Article 6 trends, negotiations, and I'm super proud to see, where Bjorn is sitting today with AITA. And this is something that, that shows you that when you start with the youth space, you can reach miles and achieve milestones through that. So Bjorn, without further ado, is joining us as an international policy advisor with AITA, and he's specialized into Article 6 voluntary carbon markets matters and also domestic emission trading system across Asia Pacific. And as I mentioned, he's joining us based in Singapore, and he's bringing wealth of experience and exposure, especially to a region that we don't have much more information about. So I'll leave you in good hands, and Bjorn, over to you.
Thank you very much, Karishma. I hope you can hear me and see my screen.
Correct.
So first of all, I want to congratulate everyone on the call today for being accepted to the Climate Finance Academy. It's a great opportunity, I think, for all of us to come together and learn from each other and really build on the ambition that exists within Youngo and within the youth climate movement to make some real difference, because we are at a very important time in human history. And I don't say this lightly, but we need to work together to really raise climate ambition. And I think this is the perspective I have taken throughout my career, and also why I'm working at AITA right now. So also acknowledge everyone. Right now I'm hearing some background noise. For being here. Here in Singapore, it's 9:30 p.m. and I think some colleagues from even further to the east, which is probably almost midnight for you, and some far to the west, which is probably early in the morning. So thank you all for joining us. I think Karishma already kind of presented my background, but basically I've been working in civil society organizations throughout my youth and when I was studying. Then I went into the private sector. Then I was working for the UNFCCC, so the United Climate Change Conventions in Bangkok. Then I wrote my master thesis on Article 6, which I saw some people were doing also in the chat. So good luck with that. And then I founded a youth climate policy think tank. And currently I'm working for AITA. So I'll explain more what this means. But again, the main reason why I've been doing this, and I think why we are all here, is because we know we are at this inflection point in human history where we see carbon dioxide levels increasing day by day, year by year, and causing ever more devastation around the world, not just in the future, but right now. And why does this happen? Well, because we have a larger amount of sources of emissions than we have sinks. And I think this is a useful presentation of the problem, because sometimes we make it seem very difficult, but in reality, the problem is relatively simple to understand. From the left, you can see all the existing sources of emissions. And on the right, you see the current sinks, land sinks and coastal and ocean sinks, but still 60% remains in the atmosphere of greenhouse gas emissions. And this is really the gap that we need to address. So how do we address it? Well, the key thing, at least from my point of view, that is missing is finance. And it's not a little bit of finance, it's a lot. The global stocktake last year from COP28 in Dubai concluded that $4.3 trillion per year needs to be invested in clean energy up until 2030. And adaptation finance needs of developing countries amounts to more than 215 to 387 billion annually. So how do we channel this finance towards the right causes? This is really the question that carbon markets tries to solve. So carbon markets or emissions trading, including Article 6, are tools. It's not kind of a magic wand. It's simply one of many tools that exists to incentivize low carbon innovation and emissions reductions, and to channel financial flows to greener alternatives. And why is it possible? Well, because we recognize that it doesn't matter where emissions reductions take place, right? We share the same atmosphere, whether you're joining from Latin America, Argentina, or Europe, or Africa, you share the same atmosphere with me here in Singapore. So the greenhouse gas emission reductions that take place here are just as effective as emission reductions taking place on the other side of the world. And this is the fundamental kind of understanding that allows for trade in emission reductions certificates, whether it's voluntary carbon markets, Article 6, or domestic ETS emission trading systems. So different countries and different companies and different regulated entities will have different comparative advantages and marginal abatement costs. And this is what allows for gains from trade. So basically, some countries or some companies will have a way of reducing emissions that is cheaper than doing it in another part of the world or by another company. And what this means is we can do it cheaper in one place, we can save that money and reinvest that money into increasing climate ambition, increasing the NDC targets, and basically coming closer to achieving our Paris Agreement targets and contributing to sustainable development. So this is the backstory, which I think is important to kind of have with us as we delve into the technical. Carbon market mechanisms came about with the adoption of the Kyoto Protocol in 1997. So as probably many of you know, the Kyoto Protocol set out binding targets for 37 developed countries and the EU, so-called Annex I parties. And to cost effectively reach their targets, learning what we saw on the previous slides, and to provide for the technology transfer, capacity building, and support sustainable development in developing country parties, the Kyoto Protocol introduced the use of flexible mechanisms. So this included emissions trading, the Clean Development Mechanism, which maybe some of you have heard about, the CDM, and Joint Implementation, JI. The most famous one is, of course, CDM. And basically, under the CDM, parties that were not included in Annex I, so developing countries, could benefit from project activities. And parties included in Annex I could use the certified emission reductions, CERs, occurring from such projects to contribute to their compliance of the targets. I think Karishma kind of went through the overall view of the activity cycle in the voluntary carbon market. And the CDM activity cycle was quite similar. It started with a project developer, which usually is a private company, a private entity, that would present a project design document. And don't worry about all the abbreviations, because I know it's a bit of a jungle. So I'll try to explain in full the different terms. They present the project design document to a host country, explaining their plans and how a project would reduce emissions. Then the government in the host country would have to review this design document, the impact on sustainable development, and approve the project. Following that, an independent third-party entity would evaluate and validate the project. And then you had an executive board which supervised the CDM under the guidance of the COPs, or the Conference of the Parties, so the big UNFCCC conferences, who would formally accept the project for registration under the CDM. And it's different methodological panels and technical committees, the ones who came up with the different types of methodologies for different projects that could be registered under the CDM. Then, let's say you have a project of waste management. Every year, you would monitor the emission reductions by the project participant. You would have this independent party verifying and certifying the emission reductions taking place. And then the executive board would accept that and issue the credits, the CERs, the certified emission reductions, that then could be sold through the mechanism, either to companies or to countries. And the clean development mechanism was, in some terms, very successful. And we can discuss maybe more detail because there are various views, of course, on kind of the impacts of the mechanism itself. But more than 7,800 projects around the world were registered in more than 140 countries. And in total, almost 2 billion tons of carbon dioxide were reduced, or at least CRs issued in the developing world. But I think more importantly, the CDM had to mobilize the private sector engagement and investment in supporting the goals of the UNFCCC and the Kyoto Protocol. Because suddenly there was a way for the private sector to invest in emission reductions and to gain some benefits or profits from doing so. So that's also when AITA, the organization I'm working for now, was set up in 1999, so 25 years ago this year. And we now have over 320 companies around the world representing the entire carbon market landscape. And our role is really to empower the private sector to engage in climate action. Because I know sometimes from a civil society point of view, we can be a bit skeptical of the private sector, and rightly so. But I think it's very clear that the transition cannot happen without the private sector. So we need to find ways of working with them to resolve the issue. And that's really what we are trying to do at AITA, to find and develop these market-based trading systems that are environmentally robust, fair, open, and efficient. So what happened with the CDM? Well, you saw a huge increase. On the graph here, you see the issuances of carbon credits. So you see basically a huge peak and then a collapse, and then again continued growth moving towards 2020 and 2021. So we have seen the early carbon markets of CDM. I don't think we have time to go into the analysis of kind of what happened during the peak and the collapse, but it was connected to discussions around environmental integrity and also the financial crisis around 2008, 2009, and the linkage with the EU emissions trading system. And what happened after this collapse was essentially that the voluntary carbon markets, especially like Verra and Gold Standard that Karishma mentioned before, started taking a larger importance in the carbon market system. And then, of course, in 2015, we saw the adoption of the Paris Agreement. And in the Paris Agreement, parties decided to include a new paragraph, which is Article 6 and the new international carbon market. So we moved into the next phase. So basically, what is then Article 6 of the Paris Agreement? Well, it's not just one article, it's actually several articles or sub-articles. But most of them deal with different forms of international collaboration to reduce emissions and promote sustainable development. So the key provisions are Article 6.2, which mainly deals with bilateral cooperative approaches between two or multiple countries that can sign an agreement to implement projects or emission reduction efforts in another country and get internationally transferred mitigation outcomes, ITMOs, or if you want to be simple, you can call them carbon credits, but they are not always carbon credits, to use towards their own NDC achievement. 6.4 is kind of the replacement of the CDM. So it's a centralized mechanism through which a supervisory body under the UNFCCC, under the United Nations, agrees to a number of methodologies and standards that then project developers have to follow, and host countries will approve projects that can then issue credits through the Article 6.4 mechanism, and they can then be sold again to be used for voluntary purposes by companies or towards NDCs, or also something called other international mitigation purposes, which mainly relates to a scheme within the aviation sector. On top of that, we have Article 6.8, which is mainly relating to non-market approaches. And for example, they are setting up a UNFCCC web platform that can be used to facilitate matching projects with financial and technical support in several focus areas. But I'm not going to focus much on 6.8 today because it's a non-market approach. I'm sure maybe Iji can speak more about it if she wishes, or if you have questions about it, I'm also happy to cover. But going into some of the details on 6.2, and I think I'm going to keep it brief, and then it's better to kind of discuss in questions. 6.2, again, is mainly bilateral or multilateral agreements, and the design options, so what the countries would sell or trade or agree on doing together, is essentially regulated by their bilateral agreements. So let's say I'm Sweden, I come from Sweden, and I want to work together with India to set up a solar farm, solar PV. So Sweden can, for example, provide financial support and technical support to India, and then they would issue ITMOs, or internationally transferred mitigation outcomes, that Sweden could count towards their NDC. There is a big difference compared to the CDM for Article 6. The main difference as compared to the CDM and the Kyoto Protocol era is that during the Kyoto Protocol, only the Annex 1 or Annex B parties had binding targets, meaning not every country had to reduce their emissions. But of course, in the Paris Agreement, every country has their own nationally determined contributions. And what this means for a trading regime or a carbon market means that we need a provision to avoid the emission reductions being counted in both countries at the same time. So they introduced something called corresponding adjustments. And this is where sometimes it gets a bit confusing, but I think we can keep it simple. I have another slide that will show you exactly the simple way of how it works. But then there's also a number of additional things that host countries needs to do. They need to report on what they are doing under Article 6.2. They need to have certain infrastructure, such as a registry that tracks all the different projects and emission reductions taking place, and how they trade or sell or buy these internationally transferred mitigation outcomes, ITMOs, with other countries. Again, under 6.4, it's very different because you have to go through the Article 6.4 supervisory body. So you have to use methodologies and standards that have been approved by this United Nations body. And the mechanism can issue both units with corresponding adjustments and without corresponding adjustments. So simply you could say they can issue units that can be used for voluntary carbon markets or for compliance purposes. And the 6.4 supervisory body has 12 members, 12 alternate members, which is mainly Article 6 negotiators from the various countries. And they are then tasked with the development of these operational rules. Now, the 6.4 mechanism is still not fully operational, and I think Ingi will kind of go into details of why even 9 years down the line from Article 6 adoption of the Paris Agreement, we still don't have the mechanism fully up and running. But there's a lot of things to unpack there. So finally, in terms of the corresponding adjustments, right? This is where you have the host country on the left. They have an NDC target, so their climate target within the host country. They reduce the emissions. For example, in the example I mentioned before, they introduce a solar PV, which would reduce the emissions in India on the left. But instead of keeping them within India, the emissions reductions, they would make them into ITMOs and sell them and transfer them to Sweden or another buyer country. What this means is that the host country, India, could then no longer use these transferred ITMOs towards its own NDC. Because of course, otherwise, both countries would count it, and then in the end, we would have an overall increase in global emissions because of this accounting principle. So this is important, but we can go into details if you have questions around it. And I think I'm going to skip this one, but this is, I think, a helpful kind of model that I developed during my master's thesis 2 years ago. And basically, it tries to explain that in order to raise ambition, we really need to look at 3 things. First of all, the environmental integrity, which is the foundation of the system and the bottom of the pyramid. Because if we don't have environmental integrity, well, then Article 6 could risk leading to an increase in global emissions. Why? Because you don't have a high quality of credits, you don't have robust accounting, or parties, that is countries, mitigation commitments or their NDCs are not stringent enough. So we need to ensure all these 3 before we move towards having a market size, a big market size. And this is looking at the differences in marginal abatement costs between different countries, political considerations of engaging with Article 6, the institutional readiness, meaning for example, how ready the host countries are to engage in Article 6. Do they have the infrastructure? Do they have the frameworks? What is the demand for ITMOs? And what are the transaction costs for moving these ITMOs or credits between the countries? And when you have that, you can move towards ambition. And ambition, of course, happens by reinvesting the cost savings that you have made through Article 6 in more stringent and more ambitious NDCs. Potentially, you can also have a share of cancellation of credits, which would lead to an overall mitigation in global emissions, which is mandatory under the 6.4 mechanism. And of course, also technological transformation, where countries would share technological innovations to basically support ambition increase across the 2 countries or several countries participating in a cooperative approach. So I urge all of you to kind of use this lens when you start seeing some of the transactions that are starting to happen under Article 6. Because implementation has started. So even though negotiations are still ongoing, and I'll let Ingi speak about this in a moment, we already see several countries on the left here, like Singapore, Sweden, Norway, Switzerland, South Korea, and also Japan, signing these agreements with the host countries on the right. And maybe you can write in the chat if you see your own country here on the right. I think there's more than 50 at this point. So Article 6 implementation is moving ahead, and the first transactions have already happened last year between Thailand and Switzerland. So just to summarize, Article 6.2, more decentralized, bilateral or multilateral. 6.4 is more of a centralized mechanism. And again, 6.2 can use any independent crediting programs or other standards, whereas 6.4 has their own methodologies and standards that all developers need to follow. And I think with this, maybe I will end because I have a lot of slides. I will hand over to Ingi so she can go into kind of the details on the negotiations, and I'm happy to discuss more of the details with all of you in the Q&A. Thank you.
Round of applause. Thank you.
And I can
Thank you for all the information. Yeah, we will maybe get with you for some little bit of discussion on also on what potential roles can youth can play in the development of international and voluntary carbon markets. Because we're all here, most of us are going to be becoming climate finance practitioners in the soon or medium term. So it would be super nice also to have a brief comment from you on what possible roles can we be taking in this transition.
Thank you, Jen.
Or later. We can do it later, I think.
Okay, no problem. We can all have this question.
Yes, so maybe for after the presentation from Ingi and then before Rosie intervenes, it would be good to reflect on, you know, the 101 on how the youth get started with Article 6 of carbon markets, because we've been having this fear in the chat that, you know, we feel lost or we don't know where to get started. It's super technical. So maybe reflect on the ABC of the steps that we've done, and then we could share that after Ingi's presentation. So now we are passing the torch to Ingi. Ingi is an incredible friend and colleague within the working group. She has been following up Article 6 during negotiations for quite some years now, and she's now affiliated with Oxford University as a research fellow in net zero aligned offsetting within the Oxford Sustainable Finance Group, and is also an associate member of St. Antony's College and a researcher at Oxford Net Zero. She's also a lawyer by training and completed her PhD in international environmental law, specifically looking into net zero as a source of legal norms. So Ingi, as I mentioned, also was and still is with Younger Working Group. So we'll let her guide us through the lessons on Article 6 and especially what we could look into the alignment with the negotiations. Over to you, Ingi.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Karishma. And thank you also to Bjorn as well for that fantastic earlier presentation. And I loved his first slide where he disclosed his age. I will do the same. I'm 28. So still youth, if not by much. But it's so great to be here today to discuss one of my favorite things, which is environmental integrity, and then kind of linking environmental integrity to the current status of the negotiations, and kind of updating on how those have evolved over the years. And just to reflect, we've seen some really great questions happening in the comments, questions about equity in terms of how the dividends from use of carbon markets are actually utilized and felt on the ground, in particular in community-based projects. We've had other questions about how Article 6 fits in with the voluntary and compliance market systems, and really also about equity. So how are different nations really engaging in the negotiations, and crucially, how can developing countries get more out of the system? Because one thing that's been very evident so far is that there has been this disconnect between the funds that are being channeled into such systems and actually how much ends up on the ground. And actually this disconnect is not only important to address for equity reasons, but it's also really important to address for environmental integrity reasons, because if money's not flowing to the ground, real new additional projects cannot be developed, nor can the communities locally feel the benefits of those. So as much as this presentation focuses on environmental integrity, it's really within that context of how can we transform the global carbon market to one that does work for both the planet itself in terms of lowering global emissions, but also for the people, especially those that are local to the projects themselves on the ground. So with that context, I'll launch off to my first slide, which is just kind of saying there's various different ways of how we might classify markets within this space. And I like to think about them in three broad buckets, but these are all interconnected buckets. So there's a lot of leakage between the three, and in particular, because of Article 6, which can kind of be the source of linking each of the three buckets. And what also gets kind of confusing about carbon markets, and something that we haven't really touched on today, is that fundamentally that can be trading very different things. So on the one hand, we have these project or credit-based approaches, which is 1 ton of CO2 equivalent avoidance, reduction, or removals, as Karishma has mentioned. But then we also have, what's common for compliance-based systems is having an allowance or unit-based system, where it's actually you're assuming the right to emit 1 ton of CO2, and that you have a kind of cap on that, and that declines. And so what gets quite confusing is that it's not that these systems stay in their own boxes. In fact, we have a lot of overlap, and some examples are on the screen here. So we can see on our left side, we have voluntary carbon market standards such as the gold standard, Verra Carbon Credit, the UNFCCC. We can see some of the descriptions here in terms of the unit from the Clean Development Mechanism, the SUR. We also see the Article 6.4 emission reduction unit under Article 6.4. But then on the other hand, we do have these assigned allowance units, as well as the EUAs, which are the kind of unit that are traded under the EU emission trading scheme, but there are various different forms. And as another question that was brought up in the chat was, is there just one compliance system? No, there's about over 75 at least at this stage, and they can maintain various forms. So most common form is emission trading scheme, but you can have carbon taxes. And again, what's been really interesting is that we're seeing increasing interplay between these systems. And that's really key for environmental integrity reasons, because if you think about it, as previously, a lot of these systems had been independent of one another, but Article 6 provides that pipeline and that infrastructure that connects all these different disparate markets. And so any weaknesses in any individual system or unit, once you pump billions of dollars into it, you can start to see where the cracks will result. And ultimately, again, that results in less money going to the ground, less money for the projects, and taking us further away rather than towards our climate goals. And so that's kind of saying that what the formal term is fungibility, but there is some fungibility between when you may be able to substitute a project or credit-based unit for one that could meet your compliance obligation. The other thing to distinguish, and it's been touched on before, but one thing that's also really important to note in our discussions is that the VCM is about $2 billion US, whereas the compliance carbon markets are significantly bigger, so 50 times bigger than those. And then Article 6 looks at to be even bigger than that, because Article 6 is the kind of main way that a lot of countries are relying on, the kind of main mechanism countries are relying on to meet their NDCs, both as purchasing nations, but also as host nations in terms of helping close that financing gap. So it's really critical we get environmental integrity right, and that is why I love that it was the foundational piece of the pyramid that Bjorn presented earlier. So we have had this kind of system of regulation and dysregulation. And I'd actually like to preface this comments with the fact that carbon markets in some form have kind of pre-existed nearly everyone, I'm sure, on this call today. So the late 1980s is when we first had the first kind of tree planting project. And really, we've seen this kind of iteration of this whole system in a process of kind of learning and relearning and uptake and then moving away from the market. And we're kind of in the second generation form of carbon markets currently. And the real question is, whether if we don't get these rules right, whether we'll again come back into this trough, or whether it will actually, we've learned those lessons from the past and we'll kind of keep building upwards. And that is still very much up for debate, and we'll see why that is later in the negotiations piece. And we can also see this kind of in market confidence. So this is the trade at retirements of voluntary carbon credits, and we can see that real flux. And so we also had a really good question about why would corporates kind of be engaging in this? The short answer is, well, sometimes a lot are making these net zero commitments. Carbon credits have been a key way that often residual emissions are addressed to help meet their net zero needs. But increasingly also we're seeing some mandatory requirements, or kind of, if net zero targets and the use of them actually being a prerequisite to access contracts, or as part of your local jurisdictional requirements. And so one of the biggest kind of trends we're seeing in the carbon market as a whole is the cycle from what started as voluntary transitioning to compliance, and compliance in two senses. So the international compliance is that your country's needing this to meet its nationally determined contribution, or domestically as well. Is it that you need to retire units to meet your own domestic compliance obligation? And we've seen increasingly that not only are we getting more emissions trading schemes and the like popping up around the world, but that the scope of them is increasing. So people may be familiar that in the EU recently, aviation and shipping emissions were included. And so we're seeing a lot of growth on a number of fronts. And so it's also important to kind of consider what environmental integrity is in theory. So again, on the PowerPoint side here, you can see that it is something that has been around for several decades, but as a norm, it's really only been significantly elaborated on over the past decade, and probably perhaps in particular over the past 5 years. And we can see kind of iterations in where the kind of concept of environmental integrity is kind of getting developed. So we can see it sometimes in NDCs themselves. We can see it in some principles that various parties have clubbed together. The San Jose principles were agreed about by about 20 different countries, and they were seeking to outline what environmental integrity means as a precursor to the Article 6 negotiation conclusions. Here at Oxford, we also released the Oxford Principles for Net Zero Aligned Carbon Offsetting, and we've revised them and released a new edition of them in February. And that kind of seeks to set the threshold for what does high integrity offsetting look like for an organization. And that's fundamentally about the need to transition away from avoidance-based projects as a means to reach net zero to removal-based ones, because fundamentally the definition of net zero is that any residual emissions are addressed with removals, and those removals have to be durable. Otherwise, it has no impact in terms of your longer term warming. That's really key. And then we also see another iteration in the voluntary standard settings, which are the core carbon principles as well. And one really critical thing about these in particular, the core carbon principles, I would say, is that a lot of these aspects sound great. So you could say additionality and permanence, but the devil is really in the detail as to whether or not, as a system, those things are actually guaranteed by those kind of rules that are put in place, or the guidance that is put in place under those standards. So we're running through a bit about what environmental integrity in theory can mean as well. So we can think about it at different levels. So we could think about it as, does the individual project have environmental integrity, the mechanism, or the overall ecosystem of carbon markets altogether? And there's a great paper, Schneider and Lahosa, who outline kind of 3 main ways that we could test whether it's present under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. So do we want to say that it's just achieving mitigation targets, whether it's the nationally determined contributions or long-term low emissions development strategies? Do we think it's about keeping global aggregate emissions staying the same? Or the last one, and what did get ultimately baked into the Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, is this concept of overall mitigation and global emissions. So that's a very fundamental principle that if we're using carbon markets, they actually have to deliver true reductions from where we are. And it goes, for many, it would go without saying, but the truth is that we've had carbon markets now for several decades. Emissions have only gone up. In part, that's due to the scale, but in part, it's also due to this fundamental lack of environmental integrity. And so we can really think about environmental integrity having 4 key aspects. So it's unit quality. What is the quality of the actual unit that is generated? How, and this involves what kind of methodology did you use to quantify it? Even what type of unit are you talking about? Under Article 6, it also really matters what is the kind of ambition and breadth of the nationally determined contribution of the host country that is transferring it. One trend that we're already seeing is that the lowest hanging fruits in some cases and NDCs are being kind of bought up and transferred out, which will only make it harder for a host nation of a project to kind of achieve their NDC ultimately. And it also kind of gives, in effect, a much lower cost get out of jail free card for the more developed countries that are relying on these much cheaper units. Robust accounting is also essential for environmental integrity. Bjorn spoke about the corresponding adjustment system that is established under Article 6.2, but also applies to most forms of credits under Article 6.4. And really this fourth category, which is what kind of systemic incentives are we setting in place? And I think this kind of really cuts to the core of not only environmental integrity kind of under Article 6, but really the issues that have been plaguing the voluntary carbon market to date. And I believe the next slide covers that, so we'll hold fire on that. But just some added context, under each of these kind of things, we can see that there's very specific kind of language that we might be thinking about in terms of ensuring environmental integrity. So especially under the robust accounting, you might see terms such as of trying to avoid double counting, double issuance, double use or claiming, how the units are converted. For example, if you've got a methane abatement project, how is that converted back to a CO2 equivalent? And this concept of vintages. So vintages are based on when the project actually delivered its mitigation outcome. So environmental integrity in practice. The short answer is that it's lacking. So there was this article that was released last year that came as a surprise to no one really in the carbon market space itself, but really did ring the alarm bells in terms of the general public, that a lot of the carbon offsets that, or carbon credits that companies have been using to offset their emissions were in fact, did not have environmental integrity. And this comes down to the baselines that are being set. And this is an example of REDD+ project, which I know has also been mentioned in the comments. And fundamentally, it comes back to that incentives question. And so one of the key issues with this is that depending on where and how you set the baseline for forest protection, it can be very easy to kind of game the system, as it were, and kind of create units that don't represent any additional protection. And even more concerningly, because they're kind of based on paying someone not to do something, it's not getting us anywhere closer in terms of actual emission reduction or removals that are needed for net zero. And so this piece on ensuring environmental integrity is pulled from the Oxford Offsetting Principles, and that really comes down to this fact of that we need to have truly additional, otherwise known as kind of new projects. Otherwise, the system really won't get us any further towards net zero. It will only take us back and kind of divert funds from the communities on the ground who can be doing the real work. So, importance of environmental integrity. As I said, it has these different layers, so we can think about it at the unit, whether the market mechanisms are effective in and of themselves, and about creating this kind of functioning carbon market ecosystem. And crucially, Article 6 is designed to not only kind of maintain the status quo, but it's really to enhance the mitigation ambition. So it's by using it, parties are agreeing to go above and beyond what they would have otherwise done. So how did this mandate translate to the negotiating room at COP26? So COP26 was where the foundational pieces of the Article 6 puzzle were laid out. It had been a very protracted negotiation up to that point. The Madrid negotiations, which were just the year prior, well, I guess 2 years prior with COVID, had kind of just moved further away in terms of there was a much more disagreement, a lot of red lines on the table, and parties just were not happy. But COP26 was a bit of a reset moment for the notion of Article 6 in terms of it started being able to, parties really did rally around getting an agreement. And crucially, they in particular rallied around environmental integrity as a concept. And as we can think about it, there was both some steps forward and some steps backwards from an environmental integrity perspective. So as Bjorn already mentioned, there was agreement on a 2% mandatory cancellation rate under Article 6.4 for overall mitigation in global emissions. Now, there was many different options on the table, ranging from 30% to no cancellation. And so it was a clear example, though, of the first time that parties had really recognized that offsetting is not a zero-sum game, that it needs to actually go above and beyond kind of just substituting emissions to really turn that curve on emissions. There was also these mandatory contributions to the adaptation fund in terms of what's called a share of proceeds. A grievance mechanism was also agreed to. So we saw some comments, and also particularly thank you, Diana, for sharing about Colombia's recent ruling. A lot of these projects not only are not delivering in terms of climate on the ground, they're also critically affecting human rights. And the Clean Development Mechanism did not have an appropriate grievance mechanism to be able to deal with those kind of claims. And so this is also a change from then to the new Article 6 system. And at COP26, parties also agreed to apply these corresponding adjustments, so that accounting mechanism, to all internationally traded mitigation outcomes. So that a reduction or removal is only counted once in one inventory. But there were some steps backwards. So there's still only voluntary cancellation for overall mitigation of global emissions under Article 6.2. There were significant allowances and concessions to transfer Clean Development Mechanism credits, as long as they'd adhere to the new standard that was set under Article 6.4. And so we could see this risk of what we termed as well at the time, Youngo, these kind of zombie credits flooding the system. So overall, there were some steps towards higher environmental integrity, but the devil remains in the detail and the implementation from that. Then next we had COP27. There wasn't so much agreed upon there, a lot of the kind of more administrative and technical details, but there was also some signs of recalcitrance on the part of the parties in terms of walking back from some of those more ambitious perspectives that they did hold or agree upon at COP26. So what happened at Dubai? Well, so despite guidance at COP26 and COP27 are being concluded on all three of those key parts of the Article 6 package, at COP28, the so-called Article 6 curse was broken, and that meant that Article 6.2 and 6.4 did not have further guidance agreed, while Article 6.8 did. And in large part, this came down to concerns over environmental integrity. What did this look like tangibly? This looked like, under Article 6.2, attempts by the EU and AOSIS, so the group of small island states, really saying that Article 6.2, because it's possesses this NDC accounting function, we really do need to put some parameters about what a cooperative approach is to ensure environmental integrity even at that stage. There was also discussions about how you may transfer between the various different registries, concerns over the human rights protections, and as well about sequencing. So what does this process actually look like? And there was also some really good questions about, in this whole process, isn't it just making it more complicated and using like a kind of mechanism that delays funding getting to the ground rather than encouraging it? And these are all great questions, and some of these kind of sequencing and very technical aspects can really help or hinder those money flows going to the right place. And then under Article 6.4, we had a discussion on the different types of projects that could be included. For instance, emissions avoidance and conservation enhancement. This was something that parties later picked up at the bond negotiations in June this year, where they did roll out emission avoidance under both 6.2 and 6.4 as a separate category, as well as conservation enhancement under 6.4. There's also discussions about how to address reversals and a discussion and debate about the process of authorization and revocation, because fundamentally, the governments are in charge of authorizing these different units. But what happens later if they try to claim them back to meet their NDC? What happens if there was fraud that happened and that these units have already been transferred and have become part of the international system? So there's a lot of divergent views about this. And the chasm between where different parties were at on these issues was in large part why agreement was not ultimately reached. So there was a lot of concerns as to what may come next from this and whether it was even going to be the kind of death of Article 6, as it were. But I think a lot of that comes down to this lack of environmental integrity or that being potentially put at risk. But at the same time, it's important to note there's a very human element in all these negotiations. And so I like to share some of these photos just to kind of indicate the very nature of the room, that these are very lengthy and technical negotiations, and that these negotiators as well have been working together often for, you know, up to 8-9 years as colleagues, and that, you know, in the kind of mode of things and manner of how these things work, it's, you know, often can end in some very crazy places, as these kind of photos exemplify. Now turning to COP29 and what's on the table. Well, after COP28's failure, as I presented in the last slide, parties are now under immense pressure to conclude negotiations at COP29, and there are a number of outstanding issues under each different negotiating item. So under Article 6.2, we have questions about the interoperability. So how can these different types of registries that are set up actually talk to and connect to one another? We have real questions about the transparency and reporting requirements. So how much detail do countries and governments have to provide as part of the utilization of Article 6? And how much of that will we be able to access as the general public? And so will we be able to track and identify exactly how much use is occurring and for what means? And also what happens again if there's inconsistencies or potential fraud, as we've seen under previous iterations of the carbon market. So we need this kind of procedure to be able to correct and identify issues before they really become have a much greater effect on our ability to reach the NDCs. Under Article 6.4, there's some key pieces of the puzzle still missing, so guidance on removals. And while it's called the guidance on removals, it actually encompasses all the different approaches about how we might address reversals. So reversals can occur both in emission reduction projects as well as removals. The classic example of a reversal is obviously you plant a tree, it dies, and the carbon gets re-released. So if you've counted an effectively permanent offset based on that, you can quickly see how the atmospheric maths do not add up. We also have guidance on methodologies that will be being agreed, and this is crucial because it is the Article 6.4 supervisory body with support from various experts that will be approving various methodologies to be part of the Article 6.4 system, but there needs to be guidance as to how they do that, what kind of key criteria they're looking at as part of that screening process. Now, interestingly, there's also still negotiations under the Clean Development Mechanism occurring. So there's a question of whether new issuances are going to occur, as well as questions about where to disperse the remainder of the trust fund. Should it go to the Adaptation Fund? Should it go to operationalizing Article 6? So these are some examples of some very practical questions that are still coming up under there. And of course, we still have ongoing discussions on Article 6.8. So perhaps the most contentious issue under Article 6.8 is this question of whether or not there should be some kind of key focus areas or priority areas to address under it. For example, often the EU wants to discuss compliance carbon markets and setting these kind of things up, whereas others maybe want to prioritize nature-based removals, or a lot of places are bringing their own kind of agenda items to this space, and it's causing a kind of debate as part of the negotiations. So one kind of thing to say about this is that overall, it will be agreed as a package. So there'll be trade-offs in terms of environmental integrity and in terms of various other aspects as part of this whole package. And perhaps more so than at COP28, because we've now had this potential failure, I think parties will be under a lot of pressure to agree a whole package. But it's also subject at the same time to the broader political fray of COP29 as a whole. So as again, we saw last year, in terms of it was the first global stock take, and we saw that issues around fossil fuel transitions and things like that, all these kind of different issue areas are always getting traded off behind the scenes between parties. And in fact, at the Article 6 negotiations in June this year, we did see it kind of being held hostage for lack of progress in other negotiating areas. So one thing that can be kind of confusing sometimes is that sometimes parties could seem to be all in agreement on something, but then perhaps because their party is trying to get a condition out of the same countries, but in a different negotiating room, they may suddenly change their tune and be very hostile about kind of agreeing to a certain provision. So that's something to bear in mind, especially if you're watching negotiations. That it's you need to bear in mind there's multiple layers of kind of politics that are occurring, and crucially also that these negotiators, as much as they're negotiating technical details about the carbon markets, nearly none of them have a background in this space, so they are fundamentally diplomats that are negotiating this. And so if you're confused, they're likely confused as well, but everyone's bringing their national priorities. And so that's why I think it's really important that Youngo works with other partners to really ensure that science, like academics and true community voices can come through in these spaces, because otherwise they're often missed off. So in summary, environmental integrity is absolutely essential for market mechanisms to effectively reach net zero, but is currently facing a lot of challenges. So the Article 6 negotiations are protracted and highly technical, and we've seen already, as Bjorn illustrated, that there's been kind of operationalization of Article 6, but we're seeing 6.2 operationalized without 6.4, although 6.4, in theory, sets a higher standard. As a result, carbon market ecosystem is trending towards one with less environmental integrity. And so this kind of classic saying that a ton is a ton is a ton, no matter where you reduce or remove it anywhere, is not yet true. And this is a big problem for the atmospheric maths, again, that we need to reach to effectively reach net zero. And so there's a true gap in net zero line offsetting, and a significant gap in particular in kind of how we may scale up the durable carbon removal that all the IPCC pathways that limit warming to Paris-aligned temperature goals require. And I've actually just got some updated stats on Article 6.2 pipeline. So we do have 86 memorandums of understanding, 11 buyer countries and 47 host countries. And so that is continuing to grow. But again, because Article 6.2 is more of a framework rather than a proper kind of accounting mechanism, there's a lot of different projects that could be set up under there, again, with very limited oversight from an environmental integrity perspective. And critically also from a net zero perspective, no removals are in that pipeline as of yet. And so we're seeing some of the same mistakes that are being repeated from the voluntary carbon market and the kind of crises and confidence that it's faced over the past few years being entrenched into the Article 6 system right now. But there's still always a chance this will change, because fundamentally Article 6 is just a framework. What really matters is how countries use it and to what extent they do so in a good way, in a robust way. And that's where I think Youngo can apply some real pressure and rigor, and really encouraging that we need to not make the same mistakes in the past about letting kind of these valuable financial flows flow to the intermediaries in the global north, as opposed to communities in the global south, where some really big transformations can occur, again, both for planet and for people. So I'll end there and pass it back to Karishma. Thank you.
Thank you, Angie. So as you all can see how passionate and knowledgeable our colleagues are from Youngo, and also within their own professional engagements. I would now call upon Rosie. Why? Because we need your support. We need youth to be empowered and also to gain more engagement within Youngo, and to have our voice heard on Article 6. It's very technical, but there is a way to start with, and Rosie can tell you more about how we accompany young people within the working group, what we do, and what is the opportunity for you there, because we've seen that it's not that you're not knowledgeable, because we've been having very specific questions, very tricky questions, and that points out to diverse dimensions in carbon markets and Article 6. So we would invite Rosie. She's the coordinator for the Article 6 group within Youngo, and also she's 16 years old. She has been a climate activist for the past 6 years, involved with Fridays for Future and Sunrise Movement. So over to you, Rosie, to convince our dear participants on how to join the working group. I will have the timer on for 5 minutes so that, we stick to time now. Thanks.
Great. Jen, would you be able to share the screen for me? Oh, thank you so much. Hi, everyone. My name is Rosie Clemens Cope. I'm 16 and I live in the USA, right outside of Washington, D.C. It's so wonderful to be here with you all. As said, I lead the Article 6 subgroup of the Climate Finance and Market Working Group, and I'm so excited to tell you all a little bit about our subgroup's thoughts on Article 6's possible benefits and risks and the recommendations that we submit to United Nations bodies that work on this topic. So to introduce myself a little bit, I've been a climate activist for 6 years with Fridays for Future and Sunrise Movement, which is a youth climate group in the US, and we push for Green New Deal policies at the state, local, national levels, and I'm co-leading the US ALCOI. I've been a member of the Climate Finance and Market Working Group since 2023, and in these recent months that I've led the Article 6 subgroup, we've authored the April 2024 YOUNGO recommendations to the supervisory body meeting in Bonn. So if you're new to all this, that was me a few months ago. I know how confusing it all is, but the great thing is that the people that taught me the most through the publications, some of them are right here on this call, like Carbon Market Watch. So yeah, I can't wait to hear them. So starting off with the potential benefits of Article 6, our working group has focused our attention on Article 6.4, since Article 6.2 is already going forward. Well, there are many aspects of 6.4 that are still being debated, as you heard. So first, I want to highlight what our subgroup thinks are important benefits that could result from Article 6.4. So first of all, the purpose of 6.4, as you heard, is to create a regulated international market for carbon, which is important because it could establish a centralized measure to de-risk carbon markets and foster a stable market environment for long-term climate investments. And two, this could implement a price discovery mechanism for emissions reductions and carbon removals across place, context, and time. And maybe most importantly, as a benefit, it could provide a politically acceptable way for richer nations to contribute to large-scale climate financing in developing countries. Next to potential risks of Article 6.4, next slide. Two of the most major are that Article 6.4 could potentially undermine overall mitigation in global emissions if carbon offsets are misused. You heard a lot of that just now from Inji. So for example, if engineering-based removals are allowed to substitute for like emissions reductions, that could be problematic. Second, if developing countries meet their 2030 NDCs by buying Article 6.4 carbon credits if developed nations meet their 2030 NDCs by buying Article 6.4 carbon credits from developing nations, it could lead to developing nations struggling to meet their 2050 targets when the cost of reducing carbon is much higher. So this is just something to think about that could be a problem in the future, because we want to be aware of the risk of like a possible climate colonialism situation and how Article 6.4 interacts with nationally determined contributions. So something our subgroup does is create positions, opinions on all of these topics. So one of them, our subgroup proposes that these risks could be minimized by provisions like increasing the 2% cancellation rate of Article 6.4 credits. So currently 2% of carbon credits are retired and are not used as like an offset. So we could increase that cancellation rate more and more as we get closer to 2050. And our subgroup also has more recommendations, such as that carbon removals, which are processes that capture and store carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, should only be used to offset residual emissions that can't be otherwise eliminated. So this means that we think both nature-based removals and engineering-based removals should never be used to extend dependence on fossil fuels. And that includes like areas like agriculture, aviation, and shipping, because we need to keep the focus on reducing fossil fuel emissions, not just offsetting them. So this is something that came up repeatedly at the this April at SB 60 in Bonn. So this is a really important topic that we get right. Another key recommendation is that we want to ensure Article 6.4 can integrate with leading compliance and voluntary markets. It's important that we implement transparent open source tracking logs to avoid double counting emissions reductions. And there's been progress on this issue, and it is crucial to achieving one of our most important objectives, which I mentioned at the beginning, is to create carbon markets that are strong and stable. Another thing that we recommend is that avoided deforestation, like emissions avoidance and conservation enhancement, should be excluded from Article 6.4. While stopping deforestation is critical to achieving carbon reductions, 6.4 is basically about offsets, and forest and conservation shouldn't really be used as justification to pollute elsewhere. I just have one more thing to say. So all these recommendations that we are things that we've submitted over the past few months, and one of our major jobs as a subgroup is to follow these specific issues being debated and come up with our positions on it. So there's going to be so many more topics in the future. And I'm so excited that some of you might join our subgroup and help us with future recommendations. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rosie. Yes. So if you could stop sharing, I would like to just have a little bit of temperature check on how many of you are interested to join the working group and to follow Article 6. Maybe by a show of a heart, that would do. Yes, so what happens is I'll go very basic on how do we operate in a team within Yongo. So you would be joining the chat, and we expect you to take, leadership and to be quite independent. We have knowledgeable people amongst us. Ingi and Bjorn are still within the chats. We are there to share our knowledge and to empower you, but also you have to come forward and take some accountability and responsibility towards joining this. So what we do is on the road to COP29, we would be having frequent calls where we would be working on documents to prepare on our positions. So our key demands, what are our views, what are our key asks from the negotiations that would happen. It can seem very technical, but once you are there in the meeting, you would be listening to how young experts are exchanging, and this is where you would learn about the technical definitions that is being discussed, about one word that can make a whole difference into the negotiation text. So we go into nitty-gritty, but you have to be consistent. Right, like Rosie mentioned, if Yongo is looking into Article 6.4, this is where you should be focusing, reading more about it, and do your part of work as well. Because as young people, we need more support, we need more capacity to represent our voice at COP29 or even beyond. So I would encourage you all to join the working group, ask questions. If there is no response, if there is silence in the chat, just just nudge us, because we are there for this knowledge transfer, and we are super excited to onboard everyone on Article 6, to be honest. So I'm sure you would do great. I've went through the questions. I cannot say that all of you are lost. Some of you know about what you are talking about, and you would be incredible assets to the youth space. So without further ado, I would now pass on to Jonathan Crook. I think Carbon Market Watch has been mentioned several times. I know Jen has something to add. So over to you, Jen.
Just very small. One little reminder as well, since we're giving a lot of advice on how to engage in the working group, it would be super important that you remember that this is a shared leadership space. That means that if you come with ideas, if you come with projects, if you want to engage in something particular, super nice that we communicate with each other in the group, and in the meetings we can feel safe that we can come with proposals or come with other ideas and have a good constructing dialogue. And this is a space for all of us to empower ourselves and engage meaningfully in the process. So now let's go back to the session, and welcome, Jonathan. Great to have you here.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation. And it's great to see so many different people on this call who are interested in Article 6, which I usually see as something that's very technical and niche, and not many people are interested in. So that's always nice to see. Yeah, so thanks to Karishma, Bjorn, Ingi, and Rosie for great presentations before me. And I will speak to the role of CSOs in Article 6 negotiations, which I was asked to present on. So I'm just going to share my screen 1 second. Okay, great. Can you see my screen? Yes, yeah, perfect. Okay. Yeah, so today I'll just speak a little bit about Carbon Market Watch and other NGOs' roles in Article 6 negotiations and why this matters kind of at a high level. So first of all, Carbon Market Watch is an NGO based in Brussels. We're specialized in carbon pricing. So we work on ETSs, CBAM, and carbon credits, of course. And so I work on the voluntary carbon market and on Article 6 of the Paris Agreement in particular with some other colleagues as well, who maybe some of you have met. Yeah, so I think very broadly speaking, this will just be a high-level overview, and probably many of you are already familiar kind of with this. But I think, and I also say this because I think Youngo operates kind of in a similar fashion as many of the climate NGOs in the UNFCCC space. So I think broadly speaking, there are kind of sort of two main tracks in which we work in Article 6. So first is kind of an outside track and an inside track. So first, touching on the sort of outside track, the point here is kind of just flagging issues that maybe are not very accessible or relatable to the wider public and to a wider audience that's not specialized in carbon markets, about sort of what's at stake, what are the issues that are being discussed, what's being negotiated, what are different countries.
So sorry, Jonathan.
No worries.
Misclick.
Yeah, no worries. Yeah, so essentially making in a concise way understandable what is Article 6 and what's at stake. And so I've circulated in the chat to a few comments, right? We have kind of a Carbon Markets 101 briefing. We also have FAQ on Article 6 and other things like that, which are aimed at a wider audience. And so, and many other NGOs that are active in following Article 6 also kind of have similar public positions, policy briefings, et cetera. And then obviously something that's very important in the lead up to COPs and SP sessions and also during the sessions is to speak to media about what's happening. Because obviously being an observer organization, it's a very privileged position to be able to partake in the UNFCCC negotiations in the informal sessions as observers. And so it's ensuring that key issues are kind of flagged and are made aware to also journalists who can reach a much wider audience sometimes than any individual or any individual organization. And then obviously, you know, using social media and speaking at side events and on panels, the UNFCCC space is something that we do, and I think that Youngo also does. So you're familiar with that too. And then sort of the inside track, this is really kind of looking into the nitty-gritty of the Article 6 negotiations. And so as I think everyone who spoke before me mentioned, right, these are very technical negotiations. The Article 6.2 text is usually about 30 pages long before every negotiation, and it's very convoluted. And so, you know, we strategize with other NGOs, so within Climate Action Network and also beyond, because there are other NGOs who are not part of Climate Action Network, but still follow the negotiations. We obviously, as a negotiation text comes out, we'll review it in detail, discuss it with one another, and then propose variations or modifications directly to negotiators. And then sort of the very crucial part is to talk to negotiators, which I think Youngo also does, right? So it's not something that you're unfamiliar with, but essentially making sure that the different voices of NGOs, local communities, and other stakeholders are well represented in the negotiation rooms to make sure that they're sort of not overlooked or lost, that they're not, don't lose sight of those, basically. And so at Climate Action Network, I think probably some of you are familiar with Climate Action Network, but it's a very important organization. So it brings together almost 2,000 CSOs across the world. There's different nodes in different parts of the world. So there's a Climate Action Network Europe, in the US, and many other parts of the world. And essentially, they also kind of adopt this inside-outside track approach as well. They have an annual policy document which comes up before each COP, where different working groups put together kind of the main key asks and demands of civil society. And this is influential in getting the word out to the wider public, but also to negotiators about kind of what are the priorities for civil society. There's the actions as well. For those of you who've attended COPs or SPs, you might know of ECO, the ECO newsletter, which is prepared basically in reaction to announcements and to updates in negotiation rooms, sometimes to put pressure on countries. And that's circulated every morning as a physical copy given to negotiators. And we often get feedback from negotiators if we call them out in ECOs. So it is something that gets through to them, and it's a way to kind of raise the temperature sometimes when it's needed. And there's also the Fossil of the Day Award, which is given to during COPs at the end of each day. If a country has been particularly problematic in a negotiation space, it can be obviously not just Article 6. That's kind of a big platform to escalate that. And so CAN has several working groups working on many different issues. So I'm actually the co-coordinator for the Flexible Mechanisms Working Group, which is the working group in CAN that works on carbon markets in particular, and with a specific focus on Article 6. But there are also working groups that work on similar topics like ecosystems, agriculture, energy, and others as well. So it's quite a broad network, and it's a way to kind of bring together different expertise of other NGOs and networks and connections with host countries and negotiators all together. And the reason I mentioned this, why does this matter? Probably the answer is obvious, but right, the UNFCCC space is a space where there is lots of influence. This is, I think this has come up in all the previous presentations, right? Different parties have different capacities, different amounts of staff that are working on, technical issues like Article 6. Some countries will have, 1 or 2 negotiators, others will have 10. So there's a big disparity in terms of influence and capacity of different negotiator countries, and that's why obviously many of them form negotiating groups. But that's kind of one big issue, is that there's a disparity in the negotiations between different parties, and so we try to the extent we can, raise the voices also of parties that are kind of pushing for higher integrity to make sure that's heard, and to put pressure to make sure that that is a priority, and also supporting sometimes some parties that might have more limited capacity. That can also happen. And obviously this, no surprise, but there are also many lobbyists and organizations and actors with conflicts of interest in the UNFCCC negotiations, including in Article 6. And so really the role of CSOs here is to ensure that, in these very technical negotiations where there's not that many organizations that are kind of free of conflicts of interest, to ensure that there are some NGOs there that are representing kind of civil society more broadly and don't have a financial stake in a certain outcome of the negotiations. And the reason I bring all this up too is because I think, as Ingi spoke to quite a lot, there are some very real world impacts for carbon markets, including for Article 6. So this can touch on the ambition of NDCs, especially for developed countries, regarding how ambitious their NDCs are, and if they kind of water down their plans a little bit to allow for some offsetting, and also how NDCs will be attained. And this is especially important for developing countries who might want to host projects, and we'll have to apply corresponding adjustments, which Bjorn touched on, right? Which is to ensure there's no double counting, but it means that the host country can no longer count that towards its own NDC. So depending on how many emissions they are going to adjust for, that has an impact on their ability to attain their own NDC. And there's also lots of issues around transparency, equity, land rights, and human rights, which Ingi already spoke to, so I won't go into a ton of detail on that, but I'll briefly speak to some of these issues. So in terms of influence, you might know of the Kick Big Polluters Out campaign, which has kind of picked up steam in the last few months in particular. Right, there's been more coverage, I think, also in mainstream media about this issue, about lobbyists in the UNFCCC space, which is initially meant, as a space for negotiations and civil society primarily. But of course, it's not a surprise that that lobbyists and interests make their way into UNFCCC spaces. So if you want to look at more of their resources, it's interesting, and I'd encourage you to check out their websites. But basically, increasingly, you see more and more lobbyists that get on, on party badges, party overflow badges, and other ways as well into the negotiations. And that means that they can have access to negotiation rooms and to negotiators, which obviously is not optimal. Yeah, and if you're interested, actually, you can download the list of participants for COPs and SPs. If you go on the respective page for COP28 or SP60 or whatever, you can click on the final list of participants and get a nice Excel which shows all the different badges, basically, and the individuals. And increasingly now, there's a space where you're meant to disclose what is your relationship with the entity that's giving you the badge. And so that it's long overdue. It's a recent change, but that gives a bit more transparency and oversight into this process. So I also encourage you, if you're interested, to look into that some more. I think now coming to ambition, right? I think it's important to recall. So you might know Climate Action Tracker, which keeps track of the ambition of different countries on climate and their NDCs. I think it's important to recall that basically no country is really aligned with what's needed for 1.5 degrees. So that's, I think, an important framing to keep in mind when we're considering Article 6, especially from the perspective of countries that would be buying credits from Article 6 to reach their own NDCs, right? We know that the level of ambition is really not where it needs to be. And there's a risk that, you know, Rosie, Ingi spoke to in particular, that this could, you know, developed countries might not adopt as ambitious a target if they can rely on Article 6 to offset some of their emissions. So just to give an example, for Japan, for instance, it has a 2030 target to reduce 46% of GHGs compared to 2013 levels. Its overall rating is insufficient by Climate Action Tracker, and there's a lot more details there. If you don't know this resource, I highly recommend it. In their NDC, Japan plans to offset 100 million tons through Article 6. It has its own system. It's the joint crediting mechanism, it's called, where it's developing its own methodologies and projects. But just to put it into perspective, 100 million tons for its NDC is about 15% of its NDC attainment would be potentially relying on credits from Article 6. So if you take into consideration the fact that overall it has an insufficiently ambitious NDC, and that it's planning to potentially use up to 15% of its achievement of its NDC through international offsets, that's not optimal for ambition. And in particular, you know, as Ingi spoke to, when we know that there's a lot of issues with many different types of carbon credits in terms of quality, to be sure that it really represents a true ton of CO2 that's reduced, removed, or avoided, that's another problem, right? If you're offsetting to reach your NDC, and if the credits aren't of high quality, that's really kind of a doubly problematic. So it's just to give a bit of framing, I think, for some of the real world kind of implications of these negotiations. And further, some of you may have heard there's a company based in UAE called Blue Carbon that's, prior to COP27, was signing lots of MOUs with a number of countries, including several countries in sub-Saharan Africa. Not a lot of details were disclosed publicly, but many of these MOUs, including Liberia, allegedly would have essentially given this company control to trade and sell credits for up to 10%, covering up to 10% equivalent landmass in Liberia. There were also other MOUs that were in Liberia. In the end, after lots of pushback from CSOs and others, it seems that this fell through and has not been ultimately, is not going ahead. But this company has has signed MOUs with other countries as well. And it's, in many cases, sometimes it's covering the landmass of a huge proportion of the country. It doesn't mean that they will come in and control and own the land, but the point is that they are, allegedly, they would be owning the rights to the carbon credits for a huge portion of the land with benefit sharing arrangements that are not transparent or are very unequal, and where you're going to quite likely have problems with land rights, human rights, and equity. And this kind of brings up this question of climate colonialism that Rosie was speaking to as well. And so there's quite a lot of literature out there if you're interested to read more about that. Carbon Brief also has kind of a resource on this, which is focusing more on kind of some of the negative impacts that can arise with carbon crediting projects. But if you want to look into some more case studies as well, you can find those there too on this website. And this is something that I think also several had spoken to before me, but essentially the question of who actually benefits from these markets is really not transparently, we don't have a clear answer. Obviously, there are projects that can be good and there can be, positive examples. It's not to say that everything is bad, but there is very little transparency in these markets regarding how much finance from the purchase of a credit goes to the developer and goes to, when local communities or indigenous peoples are involved, actually goes to supporting them. There's the number kind of thrown around that it's a $2 billion in value of the VCM, or 1 billion now, but that's a figure that's representing the transaction volume. So it's not actually representing the amount of finance that goes to the ground, but it's representing how much is kind of voluntarily reported by traders and brokers and companies regarding the number of transactions. So if a credit is traded 5 times at a certain price, that's going to be reflected in the transaction volume, the value in transaction volume. Anyway, the point is, we've written a report on this, and there's lots of journalists as well that have covered this. For a mechanism that's meant to channel huge amounts of climate finance to the ground, there is a shocking lack of transparency regarding how much actually does make it to the ground. It seems like something that would be easy to resolve, but it's not really forthcoming in the voluntary markets. And so this is a problem as well in Article 6 that we are seeking to not have it repeat itself. We've also written about kind of benefit sharing arrangements. So when local communities or indigenous peoples or others are involved in carbon crediting projects, there's a question of, right, to what extent are they benefiting fairly from the terms of a project? You know, are they getting a percentage of the carbon credit revenue? Are they getting a fixed price? Is it non-monetary? What are the benefits, and are they equitable? And again, if you look into the documentation, there's very little transparency in project documentation regarding how, you know, benefit sharing arrangements. So we've done a report on this, if you're interested to read more on this topic. And so I was going to talk more about 6.2, but Inji already spoke a lot to it, so I won't get into it here. But I think just to recap very quickly, Article 6.2 is a very loose framework. There's some high-level rules for quality around integrity, but it's, you know, really framed in a high-level way. It means that there's lots of interpretation open to countries about what they will actually do on the ground. And there's a very weak review process from the UNFCCC. And so what's really important, as Inji was speaking to as well, is to have a stronger, clear review process with transparency regarding what's happening in Article 6. And I'll spare you all the details. But this is one of the main issues going into this year at COP, and has been in the previous years, regarding whether or not we're going to have a transparent system for Article 6. So yeah, I won't go into all this now. So yeah, that's I think I can end it there, and I see we're also close to the conclusion probably. So yeah, thanks. If you have any questions, happy to take those.
Thank you, Jonathan, and thank you for wrapping it up. I know time is a constraint. So we'll just move to the next speaker, Harry Gade from World Bank. He's going to guide us through the engagement of World Bank, especially Innovate for Climate on carbon markets and Article 6. He's a senior climate change specialist with more than 16 years of experience and strategically positioned in different working groups or initiatives. And he's a leading member of Article 6 work program, piloting the next generation of carbon markets concept. So Harry, over to you, and we look forward to hearing more about also your role and also the advice that you could give us on how to be engaged. Thank you.
Thank you, Karishma. Can you see my slides?
Yes.
Yeah, I think we're seeing your presentation, like personal slides. Maybe you can switch the screen.
Wait a second.
Perfect. Now we can see it.
Oh, sorry. I moved it. Okay, can you see now, or is it still?
It's still on the presenter.
Yeah, still on presenter mode. Maybe up on display settings.
For this, it happens always. I don't know why.
Hide presenter view.
Do you know where it is?
Yeah, it's in the start view. Next to the video on the slides, the 3 dots. No.
Let me try once again. So maybe... Is it good now?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Thank you so much. Yeah, thanks again for the invitation, and great to see so many people here. And I was amazed actually how knowledgeable some of you already, and then especially I was impressed by Rosie, how she is already into Article 6, which we are still struggling to understand better what exactly that means to countries and to the international community. So I think so far you heard a lot about the technicalities about the Article 6 and of course also some of the challenges with the transparency, double counting, and of course the NDC accounting, and so on and so forth. So what I'm going to talk in my 15 minutes intervention is like what World Bank is doing in this space, especially helping both countries, but also at the global level to address some of the challenges that you all heard, and of course also to facilitate the the overall market development so that the needed financing will flow to Global South. So this actually captures in a nutshell what the World Bank is doing at the moment. Of course, we have multiple what we call as trust funds, under which we provide countries technical assistance on different aspects of carbon markets. Of course, we also work a lot on domestic carbon pricing, like carbon taxes and emissions trading systems. But of course, the funds that you see on the top also focuses mostly on international carbon markets, both on the technical capacity, but also to purchase emission reductions from, of course, from the eligible projects. So we involve in mobilization and emission reduction credit generation. I mean, like we manage almost like more than $4 billion in carbon funds, and out of which almost $2 billion already disbursed, and that has resulting into more than 200 million tons of GHG emission reductions. Of course, bank has been in this space for almost like 25 years, and then of course you may be familiar that World Bank is the one that that pioneered in terms of the establishing the first carbon fund in 1999, the prototype carbon fund. That's of course evolved into so many other funds, and then now we are in 2024, and again playing something similar role, but now to in a different context and different environment where countries have their own NDCs. And how do we actually ensure that, of course, one countries meet their NDCs, but of course, the second, how do we actually help them to increase their ambition? So that's the broader mission that we have, at least under the carbon markets agenda. We do a lot of innovation. I mean, like, for example, on the clean development mechanism, World Bank has led more than 50 plus actually, the methodologies that we use in them, like, starting with the ACM 002, MS1D, and then there are so many other methodologies that the bank led with its development, and we are now doing the same thing, but now this time not in individual project level methodologies, but mostly at the sectoral and the jurisdictional level methodologies, to increase the ambition, then of course the scale of the climate finance opportunities. And also, of course, we do a lot of carbon linked instruments. That means like how do we blend different financing instruments, and then how do we actually ensure that the carbon finance will play some meaningful role as part of the different financing sources a project, for example, receives, and then so that it of course helps us scaling up. There are a couple of examples that I can quote. Carbon linked bonds. We helped the Vietnam government to introduce recently last year, and then of course recently you might have seen similar thing in Brazil. And then end-to-end digital ecosystem. And again, I saw a lot of comments actually in the chat. I mean, like where we of course led this one using the new technologies like blockchain technology, and then how do we actually help countries to increase the transparency through both the domestic level infrastructure, but also connecting to the global infrastructure like Climate Action Data Trust, which of course is again the brainchild of the World Bank's initiative. And then, of course, we do the technical assistance. As I said, we are working with 60 plus countries right now, and then we engaged in different aspects of country needs, like developing their carbon market strategies, regulatory and infrastructure, and then so on and so forth. And of course, the knowledge and then the partnerships. I'm sure you are all familiar about the famous State and Trends of Carbon Pricing report that World Bank releases every year. We recently released in May this year's edition of the State and Trends report, and then Innovate for Climate. I talk a bit in a minute, and then the Digital for Climate. That's another initiative where we bring multiple partners to work on the digital solutions to improve the transparency in the market. And Climate Market Club and Carbon Action Forum, which of course there are different slides. Actually, I will mention in a minute. This is again a snapshot of how we evolved from 1999 to 2023 through different initiatives and then different milestones. I'm not going to go into detail, but of course, just to give a flavor that depending on the how these markets are evolving and how country needs are of course increasing, so the banks own portfolio of both activities, but also the support is evolved over a period of time. So at present, of course, the World Bank's work on carbon markets is driven by what we call through World Bank Group's Carbon Markets Engagement Roadmap, which we launched during last year's COP in Dubai. It of course talks about the three main pillars: monetization, again where it's no brainer, of course, supporting countries to monetize, and then of course we have emission reduction program design, because bank also lends a lot of money, as we all know, to different countries every year, out of which of course we systematically identify the opportunities for for carbon markets development through across the portfolio, and then help them to monetize, as I mentioned earlier. So we normally focus now on not on individual project level, but the multi-phased programmatic approach, what we call it as. That means the programs cover multiple countries and the multiple technologies. For example, one example could be providing energy access to 20 plus countries in Africa through one of the recently approved projects called Ascent, under which of course we aim to lend $5 billion to these 20 countries to provide energy access to 100 million people by 2030. And so now we are exploring how that operation could also be complemented through carbon revenues through different design and different structure, and then of course to ensure that of course the credits generated are of high integrity, and then there will be a lot of transparency through proper infrastructure that will be put in place. So those are the kind of the programs that the bank is working right now, to scale up the ambition. And then, of course, the final one, which is the one of the most strongest need right now, is of course to facilitate the dialogue at the global level. So there we work with multiple partners. We bring multiple partners into the discussion and the dialogue. So where we convene and then discuss some of the critical bottlenecks that market is facing at the moment, and then how actually we collectively think through and then come up with solutions. So that's basically what this bank is doing. And then of course the agenda for COP this year, COP also will follow something similar, and then where you can see some additional action on all these fronts. So this again, the four main pillars: supply, demand, market, and project infrastructure and enabling environment. These are the four pillars that the bank works through different initiatives. That basically summarizes what the bank is doing. So I wanted to, of course, spend 1 minute on and then bring to your attention this particular initiative, that Partnership for Market Implementation Facility, PMIF. This facility, of course, has a dual objective. One, to help countries increase their readiness and then implement the domestic carbon pricing, that carbon tax and emissions trading systems, etc., but also to catalyze the development of next generation of international carbon market, especially of course through the Article 6 under the Paris Agreement. So now we cover, of course, an advisory analytics, and then of course we do a lot of innovation and the knowledge services, and then advocacy. These are the four pillars under which of course this fund operates. We have right now more than 30 countries under this facility. So if you can see, there are the names of the countries listed on the left side. So these are the countries that we are working. The program needs for different countries vary depending on the, of course, context and then of course their immediate needs. Some countries, of course, talk purely only the domestic carbon pricing. Of course, some talk about both the domestic carbon pricing and international carbon markets. And then some talk about very specific activities that they want us to help with them. For example, gaps assessment with their readiness to participate in international carbon markets, or of course, to identify their capacity building needs or their infrastructure needs, and to have a MRV and a national level registries and so on and so forth. Of course, we also work at the regional level, for example, to identify the common needs across for example, in West Africa and East Africa. We are working with multiple countries to find what are the common needs, and then are there any harmonization opportunities across the board, so that they will be better in the positioned to participate in these markets. And then, of course, we have a very dedicated global knowledge program under which we generate a lot of knowledge on both carbon pricing and carbon markets. Of course, at the end of the presentation, you can see the links to websites. So where, of course, if you are interested to know more about what are the the reports that we published so far, and then if you may want to interested to look into them. So this is one thing that I wanted to highlight, what we call a Climate Market Club. So given that, especially for Article 6.2, which is, of course, like as we heard, this is a mostly bilateral or plurilateral, and then this all the negotiations on this, their participation happens between different countries. Of course, we all know Switzerland, Sweden, Norway. Of course, these are some of the countries that are leading this Article 6.2 operations so far. So in order, of course, for us to facilitate the dialogue, especially on the technical level, to operationalize that Article 6.2 at the domestic level. So we established this Climate Market Club, and right now we have, of course, around 15 countries, and then, of course, there are a few non-governmental agencies who are helping these countries actually with the Article 6.2 operations. So we meet almost regularly, once in a month, to discuss all the technical aspects related to operationalizing the Article 6.2. So one of the results of this Climate Market Club is what we call as approach papers. So that those papers actually deal with the specific technicalities of the things that you all heard, actually corresponding adjustments, and then double counting, and then baseline setting, the pricing strategies for the countries, and additionality, and so on and so forth. So we have almost like 10 such kind of papers that got published so far. And again, I will encourage you to, if you wanted to learn more, please visit this climatewarehouse.org website, so that where you can find all these approach papers that I mentioned. And then there is one more platform I wanted to also bring to your attention, what we call a Carbon Action Forum, which we launched again in Dubai last year. So this is again to facilitate dialogue between sellers and then buyers in the carbon markets, and then, of course, collectively discuss about the challenges both sides facing, risks, especially in terms of honoring those contracts, for example. And also to collectively design some innovative financial solutions around these transactions. So this is, of course, the government of Singapore is the initial anchor, and then there are many members at the moment. So so far we had 3 such Carbon Action Forum meetings, and then where we discuss about the all the issues that I just mentioned. But this is turning out to be very, very useful for both sellers and buyers. Not necessarily the sellers are countries, but of course it could be the project developers, like what we see is a major developers in developing countries, and then, of course, donors, obviously, from Global North. And then, of course, Climate Warehouse Program. This is another major initiative that the bank has to support the global infrastructure. And this is, of course, the Climate Action Data Trust that you heard is the resultant of this particular program, where we prototyped and we piloted, and then we demonstrated the proof of concept and how this whole Climate Action Data Trust would work. And then, of course, then eventually it is now jointly being maintained by the Singapore government, and with IETA being the secretariat for that one. And then, of course, to advance this further, on the urban infrastructure, we established this Digital for Climate. It's a collaboration between EBRD, UNDP, UNFCCC, World Bank, and then, of course, there are a few others like European Space Agency, and so where, of course, we are looking into not just only global infrastructure, but, of course, how do we actually develop more digital MRV at individual project at the program level, so that those technologies could help to reduce the transaction costs of monetization of these carbon credits. So, and then for registries, and then, of course, to see how much innovation we can do through tokenization and etc. Of course, I'm sure many of you familiar about those things, and so that's basically where this Climate Warehouse Program is, where these all things happen. And then, apart from this one, of course, we generate a lot of global knowledge on that one again. So the climatewarehouse.org site has all the information and then the knowledge on these things. Of course, this is again to depiction of what I just mentioned right now, starting from the DMRV to national level, and then to tokenization, and then how it can connect to the climate action data trust. This actually completes the end-to-end actually ecosystem that we call it as digital ecosystem for carbon markets. And then of course it's not necessary that every country should have all these things, but again, so depending on the country needs and then their capacity and their ability to regulate these things, so the configuration of these systems will change and then vary, and of course and then bank through the multiple trust fund initiative that I mentioned, so we support these countries to navigate these things. And then when it comes to especially the Article 6, so we, of course, these are the main things that we do. I mean, it's like, to develop country level policy framework where, of course, we talk about countries, how countries see the role of these carbon markets, especially Article 6, and then how they can support meeting their NDCs, and then, of course, what are the institutional arrangements that should be put in place. What is the pricing strategy that these countries should develop, because it's unlike in the past, so now countries are not in a position to sell whatever actually they wish to sell, because they need to meet their NDC, so they need to understand what it means basically transferring carbon credits at this time. And then if they end up actually being not meeting their NDC in the future, so what is the opportunity cost of meeting those NDC targets? So how those things should be considered as part of their pricing strategy. So that's of course where we use this MAC curves and etc. to as a basis to understand opportunities in different sectors, the costs of implementation, and so on and so forth. So bank actually helps countries to develop these strategies. And the infrastructure I just mentioned, what are the things? Because now with NDCs, the inventories have come much more critical, and then we all know that in many of our countries, inventories are not good. There are so many gaps in terms of the data quality and the data availability, and then accountability, etc. So how do we actually reconcile all these things in the context of doing corresponding adjustments, etc. So we talk about all those things under infrastructure strategy. And then of course the capacity building, we all know that's which is very critical, and then cuts across the in a space where we develop this capacity building strategy to cater to different levels of the capacity stakeholders in the country, and then accordingly customize the capacity building program. And then another thing, of course, we also do is developing some kind of a risk products. For example, a country decides to commits to do the corresponding adjustments. What happens if they don't honor that one in the future, when it is due for doing that thing? So how do we actually address those kind of risks? So the MIGA, which is of course the guarantee agency of the bank, where of course we normally do these guarantees for political risk, but of course now we are looking into some of these risks, corresponding adjustment risks, and so on and so forth, and then come up with some kind of a new instruments or the new kind of mechanisms to address, so that the participants can be comfortable enough where such risks exist. And then of course this is of course talks about how we look into what the World Bank does, and then what the IFC, which is the private sector arm, whose of course the main role is to help the private sector to participate in these markets. And when it comes to the carbon markets and then MIGA, so how actually we collectively work together to come up with a relevant risk mitigation products. And then of course this is one just example that I mentioned. I mean, there are many other risks, like legal nature of the carbon credits, how countries are dealing with that one, and then how do we actually help countries to better understand those aspects, and then what the regulation that they might need to bring that clarity and etc. So we of course you might have now realized that the bank works from end-to-end integrity aspects, all aspects that are very much critical and then important for the markets, and to build that trust and the transparency that is needed. Then this is also one more thing. Of course, if you're looking into a one shop, actually one place basically where get all the analytics or the data related to both domestic carbon pricing and the international carbon market. So this, I'm sure some of you may be familiar, this carbon pricing dashboard, which of course is is very used by so many publications and so on and so forth. So I highly encourage you to of course regularly visit this, and then you can do number of course, like analytics using the data that is available. All the data is open source, and then you can download as well, for different purposes that you are involved in. And then my final is the Innovate for Climate. Of course, this is the annual flagship event that the World Bank conducts. It is supported by German government and then Spain. Of course, so accordingly, the Innovate for Climate happens 1 year in Germany and then next year in Spain. Of course, this year it's happening in Berlin from September 10th to 12th. It's of course also jointly organized by IETA and then ICAP. And of course, it brings all the private and public sector players into this forum or are involved in the carbon market. So we are expecting around 500 to 600 participants. So we deliberately restricted number of participants this year to bring the more quality to the discussions and then make it much more useful. This year focuses on domestic carbon pricing and international carbon markets. As usual, of course, it will have a number of plenaries or workshops, and then of course the marketplace, which is very interesting, of course, where you can do a lot of networking and then learn from others, and then of course also enter into some kind of a dialogue on potential transactions. So innovateforclimateconference.org is a website where you can get all the information, and including the program agenda and then the topics and so on and so forth. So these are the resources that I just mentioned. So please visit the websites and to get the more information, and I'll be more than happy to clarify or to provide more information if you need. So I'll stop here and then back to you, Karishma. Thanks.
Thank you, Harry. That was super insightful, and also to know more about how the international initiatives related to carbon market. Having the resources is also the go-to slide that you should be looking for, because this is where you can learn more, you can stay updated, subscribe to newsletters, and constantly see what the World Bank and its partners are doing on carbon markets. So highly encourage you to be more active, more proactive, I would say, and coming forward to see how you can learn more about carbon markets. Without further ado, I know we are overrun by 15 minutes. We have tried our best to answer your questions in the chat. Thank you for joining us today, and I hope that the rest of the Climate Finance Academy would be as insightful as this one. As you know, this is our third edition, and we are super excited to have a bigger team, a bigger amount of participants this year. And the end idea is not just to empower you, but it's to empower you to take actions. So one of the ways that you can take actions is by joining our working group, or even doing it in your own space, in your own local, regional engagements opportunities that you can have. So if you need any further support, do feel free to reach out to the working group coordinators. Jen is our focal contact point, and Rosie is the coordinator for Article 6. And before we close, join me again to wish Jen a very happy birthday and thank him for all his effort that he does for young people, and for bringing us again to this Climate Finance Academy. Thank you, and bye-bye.
Thank you all. Thank you, Hari, Karishma, Rosie. Wonderful speakers today. Just one little message. We know that we owe you a workshop on Article 6 that it's not yet published. Like the date is not determined. We want to know your priorities, so stay tuned in the WhatsApp of the cohort of the Academy, so we can decide whether you prefer to have a negotiation simulation where you will get the chance to represent a country in this kind of efforts, or would you prefer to have a more project focused workshop where we would essentially take the roles of evaluators and presenters of these carbon projects, and we'll see how we can learn some insights from that experience. But we are super happy to have all of you here staying after 2 hours and 17 minutes of a workshop. And thank you so much, Karishma, for your time with moderating this session. Looking forward to keep engaging with you all in the next sessions. So have a wonderful day.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. See you soon. Bye.